With acrylic discs, you can achieve perfectly smooth frosting on cakes and sharp edges from the sides onto the top. They'll make your cakes look professional if you use them correctly, and in this tutorial I'll show you how. First, what are acrylic discs and what are they for? They're transparent, round pieces of acrylic, which is a kind of plastic that's very strong. Acrylic discs are placed below and above a cake to get super smooth frosting, and here's a quick diagram to explain how it works. You'll put one disc under the cake, then cover up the top of the cake with frosting and push another disc onto the top. And then spread frosting all around the sides and scrape it smooth with a cake comb, and then take the top disc off to leave smooth frosting on the top and sides of the cake. There are lots of little details to get right for this to work, so let's start at the beginning. You'll need 2 identical acrylic discs, and they should be about half an inch wider than your cake layers. Measure the width of your cake layers after baking and cooling, because some cakes will shrink, so they won't end up being the same width as the pans you baked them in. For example, this is my very vanilla cake, and I baked these layers in 6-inch pans, but after cooling, they measure 5 3/4 inches. So I'm using a set of acrylic discs that are 6 1/4 inches wide, which is half an inch wider than the cake layers. Okay, so what are you going to need to be able to use acrylic discs? Aside from your 2 identical acrylic discs, of course you're going to need your cake. You'll need some buttercream frosting, an offset spatula and a frosting comb, a straight-edged one, to be able to apply the frosting to the cake. And you're also going to need some parchment paper, and this stops the discs from sticking to the cake and frosting. And you'll need some scissors and a pencil to trace around the parchment paper. You'll also need a turntable and a non-slip mat, and 2 cake boards that are at least 2 inches apart, a small cardboard cake board the same size as your cake, and a larger one of any material. To make it easy to remove the top acrylic disc, you need to line it with parchment paper, which is non-stick. Trace around a disc and cut that circle out, and use 4 tiny dabs of buttercream to attach the parchment to the disc. I recommend putting this disc into the freezer for about 5 minutes to set the dabs of buttercream to attach the parchment securely. Assemble your cake on the cardboard cake board, spreading a dot of buttercream onto the middle of the cake board to secure the first layer of cake, and then trim around the cake board if it's sticking out around the cake, which happens because, like I mentioned, some cakes shrink when they bake and cool, and you want the cake board to be the same size as the cake, so you might need to trim it. Then alternate between cake and filling to assemble your cake. I recommend chilling your cake layers for about 15 minutes in the freezer first, because when they're cold they're firm and less crumbly to frost. And if the bottom cake layer is cold, it will chill that dot of buttercream on the cake board to set it, and that will hold the entire cake steady while you assemble and frost it. Get down to eye level to make sure each layer is directly on top of the layer below it, so that the sides of the cake are straight. Now cover the cake in a crumb coat, which is a thin layer of buttercream or frosting to trap any crumbs that come off the cake. If you skip this, you'll have visible crumbs in the frosting on your cake. Place the cake on its little cardboard cake board on top of the bigger cake board, with a non-slip mat in between to hold the small cake board still. And the big cake board gives you a large flat surface to rest your cake comb on later to smooth the crumb coat, and it stops the frosting getting all over your turntable too. Trimming the cake board earlier was important because next, the final coat of frosting is going to cover up the crumb-coated cake and the cake board, so the board will be invisible. Scrape around the cake with a cake comb to smooth the frosting a little bit, but as long as there isn't any exposed cake, a messy crumb coat is fine because it's going to be covered up in a minute. Now put the cake in the fridge for 30 minutes or the freezer for 15 minutes to set the crumb coat. Meanwhile, tint the frosting for your final coat, and when the crumb coat on the cake has chilled and it's firm to the touch, take the cake out and slide an offset spatula underneath the cake, in between the big cake board and the little cardboard cake board the cake is sitting on, to separate the cake on its board, and lift it up. Place a non-slip mat on the big cake board and one of the acrylic cake discs on top, and then spread a dot of buttercream onto the middle of the acrylic disc and lower the cake back down onto that dot, and I'll skip ahead to show you why. The cake will push that dot flat, and the coldness of the cake will chill and set the squashed dot, which will act like glue to attach the cake on its little cake board to the acrylic disc, so it doesn't slide around. Centre the cake on the acrylic disc, and then for the top of the cake, cover it with a generous amount of buttercream and push that buttercream over the edges of the cake to completely cover the top. And then press your second acrylic disc down onto it with the parchment facing down, so it's pressed against the buttercream. Push a cake comb sideways, making sure the bottom is resting on the big bottom cake board so that it's straight, and it should touch both the bottom and top acrylic disc. If it doesn't, adjust the top disc so that it's directly above the bottom disc, and that way your cake comb should touch both discs. Now spread buttercream around the sides of the cake, and it needs to be thick enough so that it goes up to the outer edge of the acrylic discs. Press your cake comb up against the edges of the acrylic discs and scrape around the cake to smooth the frosting, going around a few times, and then touch up any indents by spreading on more buttercream to fill those in, and then scrape again. If you're struggling to get the frosting perfect, probably because the top disc is sliding, put the cake in the freezer for 20 minutes or the fridge for an hour, and cover the leftover buttercream in your bowl with plastic wrap so it doesn't dry out. Take the cake out of the fridge or freezer and spread the leftover buttercream over the frosting and scrape again, and now that the top disc is secure, you should be more successful. When you're happy with the sides of the cake, put the cake in the freezer for 20 minutes or the fridge for an hour to set the frosting, and then use a sharp knife to separate the top acrylic disc from the cake. Lift the disc off and peel the parchment off from the cake, but don't expect the frosting to be perfect yet. You'll have little air pockets or indents where the acrylic disc didn't push down far enough to stick to the buttercream. You can spread more buttercream over those areas now, scraping the excess off with your offset spatula or cake comb, and because the rest of the frosting has chilled and set, you won't damage your smooth sides or top. Scrape around the sides of the cake, angling your cake comb to press against only the top of the sides to push this fresh buttercream you've just spread on so that it sticks up above the top edge of the cake, and then swipe sideways to lift it off the cake. And there's your beautiful sharp top edge. We're not finished yet. To separate the cake from the bottom acrylic disc, slide your knife or offset spatula between the disc and the cake on its cardboard cake board. Go all the way around the cake and then lift the cake up, which you can do because the frosting is cold and firm. Then transfer the cake onto a cake stand or a cake board or whatever you want to transport or sell or serve it on. Neaten the bottom edge by spreading gently around it with an offset spatula, and ta-da! A perfectly smooth and angular frosted cake. What do you think? Are acrylic cake discs worth the extra steps to get super smooth frosting? Tell me in the comments. Visit my cake school on BritishGirlBakes.com to learn hundreds of cake decorating techniques and designs. Thanks for watching.